Hello, I'm Julie and I'm expecting a baby boy in October. Welcome to my mini sewing series where I attempt to make some of my baby stuff myself so that this little bundle of joy breaks my needles instead of my bank account. Today I want to show you how I made these custom size boxes for under our changing table. They have a few imperfections, what at first made me a bit reluctant to post this. But making perfect boxes was not the point of sewing them myself. The point was to make practical items on a budget that I love because I made them. And I also love how the colors look in our living room. For the pattern, I will show you how to draw it on a scrap piece of paper using simple measurements because this is easier to explain. This is what the pattern that we're making will look like. It looks like a cross. We're first going to make a square and I explain the formula for calculating the measurements of your square right now. For this example, I want the bottom of the box to be 20 centimeters on 20 centimeters. That is 8 inches on 8 inches. If you want to sew this box, you will need to add seam allowance to your calculations. I want 1 centimeter, around half an inch seam allowance. So I'm going to add 2 centimeters or 1 inch to the bottom measurement, 1 centimeter for each side. That makes the bottom measurement 22 centimeters on 22 centimeters. That's 8 inches plus 1 inch seam allowance. For this example, I'm going to use 10 centimeters for the height. That's around 4 inches. For a neat finish, you will also need an additional 4 centimeters or 1.5 inch in the height. This will give you enough seam allowance to sew the lining inside the box. And also to fold a part of the box over at the edges, what I think gives a clean finish. So the total height right now is 14 centimeters or 5.5 inches. Now you need to take the height plus the seam allowance and double this. And now we add this to the bottom measurements. So that is the 22 centimeters or 9 inches plus 28 centimeters, what is 2 times 14, or 11 inches. This makes 50 centimeter or 20 inches. Now you need to draw a square with this measurements. Now to turn this flat square into a 3D box, we need to remove the corners. Draw a smaller square in the size of your height measurement, so the 14 centimeters or the 5.5 inches, and use this as a template to cut a square out of each of the 4 corners. Once the corners are cut, you will be left with a cross or a plush shape. Now you need to attach the sides of these flaps to each other to create a box. Here you see that with all the seam allowance calculated in, I have a box from 20 centimeters on 20 centimeters and with a height of 14 centimeters, with after sewing will be 10 centimeters. I made a pattern using the formula in the dimensions that I needed. For my outer layer, I'm using this faux fabric. It's the same fabric that I used to redo our camper. These are the leftovers. So according to Girl Math, they are free. It's also a fabric that is easy to wipe and babies are a little messy, apparently. Once the cross is cut, you take every edge of the cross and bring them together. I use these little sewing clips instead of pins because I found that easier. I also drew 1 centimeter seam allowance and then I sewn this together. I used a walking foot to do this. These are really handy when sewing denim or other heavy fabric. I will link this below together with the sewing clips if anyone is interested. Then I pressed the seam using a press cloth to protect the fabric. My press cloths are just tea towels and nothing fancy. I also cut the little edge at the end of the seam open and I gave it 1 more press. Repeat this for all the corners and all the seams and ta-da-da-da, you have yourself a box. I also wanted a lining in my box, so I used the same pattern to cut it. I'm using some fabric that I ordered on Vinted for a dress, but the listing was in French and I overestimated my French and ordered the wrong kind of fabric, but it's perfect for the inside of my boxes. For sewing, repeat the same steps. Pin and sew the corners together and press your seams. Then I slit my lining over the outside of the fabric with the right sides or the pretty sides together. Then I sewn this on the top using that 1 centimeter or half an inch seam allowance that we calculated in our pattern. But I left an opening from around 10 centimeters or 4 inches so that I could turn this inside out. Once you turn this inside out, be sure to use the opening to press out all the corners of the box. You notice that these boxes don't stand up on their own unless you're using a very strong fabric or the box is quite small and a square. So you need to add some structure to the insides. I used this. This is isolation meant as underflooring for laminate flooring. I know, kind of weird, but I had this in our shed that makes it free, and I like free things. And I'm also trying to make some more space in our shed. So it's a win-win.
Wow, you're really cleaning house.
Gotta get rid of the old garbage, make room for the new garbage.
To my own surprise, this was very easy to sew using a walking foot and a standard needle from 90/14. My old sewing machine took one for the team here as I'm trying to keep my Bernina away from my shenanigans. But please tell me in the comments below what is the weirdest material that you have ever sewn with or used in one of your projects. I really want to know this. To insert this stabilizing layer inside the box, I first cut the pattern down by 4 centimeters or 1.5 inches. This is to ensure that you can still do that neat roll-up finish at the end. Next, I cut my underflooring and stitched the cross sides together. You might need to use tape or glue depending on which materials you are using. I graded my seams very small as pressing this was pretty difficult, and then I turned the piece inside out. I used that little opening that I left in between the lining and the outer fabric to get this in. I folded it 4 times, then I slid it in and then I opened it up again inside the box. Be sure to push all the corners out very well. To finish the box, I folded 4 centimeters or 1.5 inches over at the top of the box. Remember, we added this extra length in the pattern making process. You can simply press this in place and leave it like this. I decided to add a little bit of fusible interfacing in between this. For this little box, the fusible interfacing was enough, but on the bigger ones, I did need to sew along the edge. I will explain that further later in this video. What if you want to make a rectangular shaped box? A rectangular shaped box follows the same basic formula as a square one. I measured the dimensions of my changing table. The only difference is that you have 2 different measurements for the bottom. You still need to add 2 centimeters of seam allowance to each side. For the height, add 4 centimeters for the top roll finish. Then you double the height and you add this to side 1 and side 2. Then you draw a rectangle with these measurements. The corner square is still simply the height of the box. I used the same method as for the square ones. This is all just rectangular and a lot bigger, what comes with a few extra challenges. With a bigger box, especially if you are sewing a square box, the sides become a lot weaker. This happens because the unsupported stretch of the fabric between each corner gets longer as the box gets bigger. So there is more room for the sides to fall inside than with a smaller box or with a square box. I used the same materials and techniques as before. To add some extra stability, I also added a base to my 2 boxes. I had some vinyl left over. We did a lot of construction in this house, so I put this to good use to make the boxes a bit more solid. I cut the vinyl in the same size as the bottom of the box without the seam allowance, and I placed it inside the stabilizing layer. To finish the box, I folded the 4 centimeters or 1.5 inch over at the top. I first tried finishing it with hemming tape, but this didn't provide enough support for the box, so I stitched alongside the edge instead. This was a little difficult and might not be my best stitch ever, but it's there. And that's a box checked off from the things that I wanted to sew before my baby boy gets here. If this video was useful to you, please give me the thumbs up, leave a comment, especially if you have any baby tips for a new mom, very welcome. There's also a new hype function on YouTube, so if you can hit that button, you would make me very happy. Thank you so much for watching until the end. Bye!